Hello again, 201. We will go over some of the topics here in Chapter 14 on Australia and Oceania to conclude World Regional Geography. And we'll try to do the first three in this particular video, then we'll finish up with the last two on the economics and geopolitical considerations. Global warming is a big environmental issue in this region of the world. New Zealand glaciers are melting. Australia suffers from frequent droughts and wildfires. The Great Barrier Reef has been damaged, and a lot of low-lying islands are flooding because of the rising oceans. Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal, and most emission from coal-fired power plants, as we've seen in other regions, creates a lot of air pollution. And New Zealand is the opposite of this. They have aggressive carbon taxes on companies with too high of emissions, yet a booming economy has seen an increase in emissions. And a flatulence tax has also been proposed on livestock owners. And again, we're trying to see what was going to happen with the low-lying islands, especially in Micronesia. Many places have problems. Tsunamis result from earthquakes, and they can be devastating on low-lying areas from the huge waves. The Kyoto Protocol was ratified. That's attempting to deal with global warming, and the United States has not ratified that treaty. The invasion of non-native plants and species is a problem. That was a problem with rabbits in Australia. So they did the purposeful introduction of myxomatosis, and that disease controlled the rabbits then. Sheep and cattle ranching has historically been a huge business in Australia, and that helped to lead to soil erosions because of overgrazing by those herds. There's a lot of wild goats, horses, pigs, and other creatures in various parts of Australia, and the island bird and plant species have been ravaged by mammals like rats that eat them. And the moa, an ostrich-type bird, that was actually exterminated by rats in New Zealand by the 19th century. This is also a problem in other island areas of Polynesia. Guam, many of you in the CNMI are familiar with this. The brown tree snake has been a problem. If you see it, report it to the authorities. An atoll is a combination, this is just a straight geographic term definition, combination of narrow sandy islands, barrier coral reefs, and a shallow central lagoon. And archipelagos also dominate much of the island region of this part of the Pacific. Australia is the largest country in land area and population. Hawaii is an example of a geologic hotspot where magma forms volcanic uplifts, and it's still growing. There is an actual volcanic area that is actually spewing it all the time in Hawaii. The islands are actually growing in that area. And New Zealand is dominated by volcanic mountains. Population, the Aborigines were the indigenous people. And this area has seen a complex interplay of local, colonial, and global scale forces. And there have been, this is again the original indigenous people in Australia, and there has been a lot of problems with the groups that had come in the 18th century with the beginning of colonization by groups that were descended from Great Britain. Historically, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia developed centralized kingdoms in which a chief or a king ruled, and Hawaii was the most powerful kingdom of Polynesia. And there was an imposed colonial framework. They replaced the Europeans' fluid territorial boundaries with precise but unstable colonial borders, and we've seen that in other regions like sub-Saharan Africa. Australia still uses these boundaries today, and New Zealand followed a similar pattern, and both islands were united in a formal dominion with the British Crown in 1907. Most of Oceania was colonized by the end of the 1800s, during the same period as the scramble for Africa. Germany played a major role in the division of Oceania, and by 1885, New Guinea was divided into 3 territories. The west was controlled by the Dutch, which is near Indonesia, the southeast by Britain as you get closer to Australia, and the northeast was controlled by Germany for a time, which was consisting of the Solomons, Micronesia, and Polynesian Samoa. Eastern Polynesia was controlled by France, the Society Islands, the Marquesa Islands, and the Tuamotu Archipelago. Farther west, they controlled New Caledonia and Melanesia, and New Hebrides in a condominium or shared power situation with Britain. And the French have produced their own distinctive island subregion. Britain gained additional islands in the South Solomons, Fiji, and Western Polynesia, the Pitcairn, and the Tonga was an indigenous state that remained independent. The Maori navigator Abel Tasman spotted the islands in the 17th century, and then the British sea captain James Cook surveyed New Zealand and Australia in the late 18th century, and Britain established a penal colony on Australia, and they got rid of their jails. They emptied their jails. Convicts, you can leave. You can go to Australia if you like, and many sailed there, and many settled originally in 1788 near the Botany Bay in Sydney, what is today the city of Sydney. And this penal colony began European colonization. The free settlers eventually outnumbered the convicts, and these English-speaking people began moving inland because they found gold. And then the British government encouraged immigration, and they paid for passage, and new settlers then came into conflict with the native Aborigines, and in Tasmania, Aborigines were actually hunted down and killed. And by the 1850s, Australia had driven the Aborigines into submission, and it's been a English-speaking country since that time. And in 1840, Britain formally declared sovereignty over the region. And as English settlers expanded into other islands, conflicts with the Maori population and wars on New Zealand took place. And the Maori were the original indigenous people in New Zealand. In Hawaii, the native Hawaiians ruled a united, powerful kingdom until 1898, when United States plantation owners, under the guidance of Samuel Dole, they forced annexation by the military forces. And Guam was also acquired as a result of the War of 1898. Eastern Samoa was acquired by an agreement with Germany and Britain. After World War I, all the German possessions in this region of the world were divided up. The Japanese gained the possessions in Micronesia, Melanesia went to Australia, and Polynesia was gained by New Zealand. After World War II, Japan's empire was stripped and controlled by the U.S. under authority of the United Nations. Australia inherited British areas in New Guinea and the German areas in the northeast. New Guinea was still relatively unexplored by Europeans, and in the 1920s they discovered gold there, and this is the last area where the Highlanders are one of the last unexplored people on the planet today, and there are conflicts there now since the 20s and 30s. Urbanization is also happening in this region of the world. Australia and New Zealand are highly urbanized, westernized societies. There was a lot of manufacturing that was done. The same sort of phenomena has gone on there. As agriculture became more mechanized, those rural populations then migrated into the major cities. And the major downtown areas in these two regions really resembles North America. And these are some of the big cities. And they have very nice conditions. clean streets, spacious parks, efficient public transportation. And these are very affluent regions, in contrast to Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most definite poorer areas in Oceania. There are huge gaps between rich and poor. And these are some of the other areas that have urban centers. And they have problems as a result of the move to a global economy. The culture, it's a land of immigrants, Australia. Still largely European dominated, but Asian cultures every decade now come to have more and more importance. Alcoholism and skin cancer have been problems. And the Kanakas were inexpensive workers that were imported from the Solomons and New Hebrides to work the plantations. Historically, immigration was limited by a white Australian policy which promoted European and North American at the expense of other groups. That has changed since the 1970s. Today, immigration, 40% plus, comes from Asia. English is still the official language, but 2.5 million residents, and I'm sure that's a dated statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It's definitely higher now. Christianity is still huge, and these other religions are growing. And economic ties with Japan are reshaping the cultural geography, and many are learning Japanese now. The indigenous Aborigines in Australia control reservations that have their sacred cultural landmarks. And we mentioned heart disease as being a problem. The Maori population in New Zealand, and they are attempting to preserve their language by teaching it in schools. We've seen that in other parts of the world. Auckland has the largest Polynesian population of any city in the world, and there are more and more Asians living in New Zealand. The islands is a mosaic. Pacific culture is rapidly adjusting to colonization, global capitalism, and popular culture. Television exposed Samoa to American football, and a lot of football players come out of that island. And also because of missionary work by the Mormons. Many Samoans have gone to school at Brigham Young University. And geographically, Australia and Oceania are united by these three characteristics: a youthful geography, very youthful population, a wide degree of cultural variety, and historically they were very isolated until the 20th century from the rest of the world. And if you wanted to see more on the languages of this particular region, there are excellent graphics in the textbook. And we mentioned earlier how the New Guinea Highlands contain some of the last uncontacted peoples, quote, to be discovered by the Western world. Village life dominated Melanesia of less than 1,000 people. Activities revolved around that group, not the individual. And European stereotypes portray Polynesian life as idyllic and peaceful, although historically it was quite violent and warlike. Pidgin English has been developed in the last 150 years. Bits and pieces of indigenous languages then get combined with formal English, and that's what results. That's an interesting term. And colonization by Europeans changed the cultural geography of the Pacific world. And King Kamehameha originally entertained whalers, missionaries, and naval officers with open arms in the 1850s. Haoles, the light-skinned European Americans, began acquiring lands, and they made immense profits from the plantations. There was a labor shortage, And that resulted in more Japanese and Chinese and Portuguese being brought into Hawaii. And these are the percentages in the 20th century and into today. Again, the key word to remember for this region of the world is the mosaic. There is such a combination of different cultures. And we talked about Pidgin English. That's a really cool word and idea. It's English vocabulary reworked and blended with Melanesian grammar. And that came as a result of trade. And that tends to be the language of commerce and people working in commerce. And there is a growing influence of globalization, and that leads into part 2 of chapter 14.